Hello, class. It's Sandy again. I'm here this week. We're going to be talking about different ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are writing online. And I'd really like you to think about what happens for Indigenous people internationally too within that space. It's really worth a look-see and even a comparison. So the focus is always on writing because that's the focus of our course. But we're looking here at probably a more immediate, sometimes a more informal, and sometimes gathered, but sometimes individual process that people are using to be able to get their writing out there. So the writing ranges from creative work to non-fiction. And you would have seen that the primary focus for this week in the reading and in the initial thinking about this was on Indigenous X. So you've probably read a little bit about Indigenous X, probably the piece that I co-wrote with Luke Pearson, who is the founder of it, and with Sandra Phillips, who's an associate professor over at University of Queensland, where we talked in that article really about some very interesting ways that Indigenous X has been deployed. And there's a little bit of brief history of it in there as well. So it started in 2012. So it's only 8 years old, but it's kind of transformed in that time in the way that social media has. And what you'll see as a theme across this week is a discussion of how social media and its changes has affected the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are writing and affected the way that we are delivering information to one another. At some stage, this was called blogs. And of course now, a few years later, blogs are still there, but they're far more directed when they're still available. And particularly when they're taken up, when people are actually engaging with them. And I'll use some examples of those. But oftentimes it's bringing these sites together that's really crucial, and that's crucial in terms of understanding the connection of themes, but also being able to have a more directed voice in that space. So Indigenous X is both an example of that and its equal opposite, because one of the things about Indigenous X is that it's always authored by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's usually an article attached to every new person who takes over, and we know that's 52 times a year, because 52 times a year there's a new person who manages the rotating Twitter account, who puts their name at the front of the @IndigenousX, and who then uses it to push their agenda. So whatever that is. So if you go in and you're interested in education, then you often will be tweeting about education. Or if you're interested in political stuff, then you're often tweeting about that. And so people go in there with the expertise and the drive and the interest that they have, and they push that. And so you end up with very diverse ideas, crucially, but you also end up with very diverse people. And that's a really important part of what Indigenous X does. So Indigenous X will lose thousands of followers every time there's a very unpopular person on there. And Pearson, in spite of that, still puts unpopular people on there because it's important to have representation and not to cherry pick that. And so it's a risk, but obviously it has a very large following. If you were able to see behind the front-facing part of it, you'd observe that there are a lot of people who are engaged with it, who are following it on Twitter, for instance, who are in the media. So it also acts as a kind of influence for other material, and I think that's really important. It's op-ed. And we'll talk a bit more in the tutes about what op-ed means. But, an op-ed does effectively mean that this is an opinion. And at the same time, there isn't material that's put out there that's not able to be backed up. It's crucial that it has the support of being able to argue a case and then prosecute that case. So Indigenous X is a good one to start with. I've put up a few images behind me of exactly what's happening with the Indigenous X website, which is a kind of repository, like a blog, except what's different than a blog? There's no feedback, so there's no potential for that. And the feedback issue, or the potential for people commenting, is actually one of the reasons that a lot of First Nations writers have moved away from blogs. The capacity to kind of control the negative criticism, massive negative criticism that happens, was what led to a change in Indigenous X. It used to have a comments section and it actually removed it. The Guardian, as an example, has removed the comments from a lot of the Indigenous-focused articles of any kind. And so it follows that path. But I want to, rather than focusing on the negatives with it, I really want to focus on what it does do. And one of the crucial things that it does do is that it constructs themes. So, and it doesn't construct them in a way that suggests that you need to write into that. So if you're a writer who pops along, a First Nations writer who pops along and wants to write something, you don't have to write into history or race and racism as you see up there. But your work, if that is the theme or the tag attached to it, right, might be then curated into one of those spaces later. And so what it means is that for us, we can use those tags and use those themes as readers of the site to be able to locate issues around identity, history, race and racism. There's one at the moment on debunking themes. I'm not sure if they put one up for Ida Hobbit, which is on the Friday that we have our toot. But, you know, there's some articles on that. And there's probably, crucially, you'll start to see if you look through the site that a lot of the writers that you've been reading are also represented on Indigenous X. So they've, at some stage, hosted Indigenous X. And so in that hosting, they've then written some articles. And in fact, you'll see that there's some other writers who've written multiple articles. And so I've just got up Karen Wilde at the moment, the poet, and you can see the work that she's put up there. You know, she's got a challenge to Fraser Anning's Final Solutions speech. She's got If Ancestors Could Vote. So she's got these provocations. You know, it's not to do with her poetry. And of course, in a whole lot of ways, it also is. You know, so there's a really interesting interplay. And so if you're looking at someone like Karen's work, it's interesting to see this non-fiction work that she does alongside it. So that's the story in a whole lot of ways of Indigenous X. But the story doesn't end there. At the moment, this is on Twitter, it's on Facebook. They've done a little bit of a foray into YouTube, and they're looking in the future at the best way to disseminate. And it might be through podcast. It might be through some other means of being able to get something out that they are not only authoring, but they're publishing. You know, and that's the sort of crucial difference often, is if you want to get something out. I know as a writer of academic articles, if I write something, 6 months or a year later, you can read it. Very rare that it would be less than that. I think I had to wait 8 years once for something that I wrote to come out in publication. That's standard. But it's, if I write something for Croaky or for Indigenous X, or if I write something for Critical Race and Whiteness Studies, I can get it out the next day. And it can still be peer reviewed. It can still go through that process of being checked for facts, you know, but it's a much, much quicker process. And of course, if I want to do it myself, I can do it on Twitter right now. So there's a whole set of issues around what platforms people are using, how those platforms have changed. Again, blogs, vlogs, Insta stories, or you know, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. All of these are still options, but they have different audiences, and we know that. We know that it's an older audience largely that uses Facebook. We know that it's often a professional, weirdly, group that in Australia that uses Twitter, or a very active, proactive group. And we know that Insta stories work in quite a different way. We know that YouTube is curated in a very different way. Just pragmatic videos like this, notwithstanding people who are actually running YouTube channels. And so we're even seeing it, I think, at the moment with TikTok, so there are these opportunities to be able to get messages out there, but to recognize that the audience changes. So starting to think about what audience means has been a crucial part of this semester. Thinking about audience reaction and audience response is also crucial. So while there's no feedback potential on the Indigenous X website, there is on Facebook, there is on Twitter, and these pages are promoted in that space. So in the next video, and there's only 2 videos in this particular week, I'm going to talk about some of the other people and some of the other themes that exist around this. And so I'll join you in that. Thanks.